Greetings! I've set up the camera to record and I've got the lavalier microphone clipped onto my collar, so it must be time for yet another episode of Zilog and Moto. Or maybe it's time for my super secret second channel, where I review different ways to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Spoiler, stop trying to make peanut butter and orange marmalade work. It's never gonna happen. In all seriousness though, welcome to episode 188 of Zilog and Moto, the channel where I have a singular goal of collecting complete copies of every English language game for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And that English language descriptor is key because there are literally hundreds of games if you look at the libraries for all four of those consoles that were not released in the United States. So far for the channel, I've gotten games from all over Europe, Australia, and of course Brazil for the Master System. Although I don't think I've reviewed any of those Brazilian Master System titles yet. I should get on that and do at least one of them. Later on this season. It's time. We're 5 seasons in now. But today, it's not an insanely far into the 90s 8-bit release. No, actually, it's a very, very early 16-bit release instead. One of the unofficial rules I have for the channel is that I space games that are part of a series 100 episodes apart, which ideally keeps things fresh for both you and I. For you from the aspect that you're not seeing me review different John Madden football games over and over, and for me in that, especially in games that I like, it allows me to have a fresh outlook on those games that I might otherwise get tired of due to their similarities affecting their review score. Well, having a gap of 100 episodes is what's supposed to happen anyway, but there's a few times so far in the schedule where I may have forgotten about a certain title, and this week's review is one of those. Way back in Season 1, possibly even when I was still using a GoPro camera to record these, if you can believe that, I decided it would be a good idea to review the cartridge that a lot of people in the US think of as the beginning of the Master System's lifespan, and that is the dual game cartridge of Hang On and Safari Hunt. Combining Hang On and Safari Hunt was an interesting idea as it allowed players to have games that used both the control pad and the phaser on the same cartridge. And afterwards, Nintendo would famously issue a similar cartridge with the action set version of the NES that combined Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt that anyone in retro gaming has probably seen a million copies of over the years. Anyone that's played Safari Hunt knows that Hang On was clearly the draw of the two for players, as it's a surprisingly solid port of the arcade game, especially due to the large disparity in power between Hang On, the arcade board, and the Master System, with Hang On actually making the first appearance in arcades of Sega's Super Scalar series of arcade boards. With Hang On being one of the early linchpins of the Master System, it should come as no surprise that Sega decided to release its sequel, Super Hang On, early in the lifespan of their next console, and that's exactly what they did, with Super Hang On not being a launch title, but still appearing in the first few months of the Genesis, releasing just in time for Christmas of 1989. For Super Hang On, did Sega faithfully recreate the Yu Suzuki arcade classic, or is there possibly more here than meets the eye? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package.
And here's my copy of Super Hang On. For a game that is rapidly approaching 34 years old at the recording of this video, I think this copy is in fantastic shape, but not quite perfect. The hang tab is very much intact at the top of the case, and the outer cover has completely held up with no scratches or tears anywhere, and only the smallest divot on the rear of the case over one of the holes. Much like the outer cover, the inner cover looks fantastic as well, with no sun bleaching or edge wear. But if you look very closely at the lower right-hand corner of the cover, you can see that there is some wrinkling, indicating that this did get a little wet at some point, unfortunately. But thankfully, with it being in the darker area of the cover, you really have to look close to see it. As far as the front cover goes, you can tell that this is a very early Genesis release, as it has the combination of the black cross-hatching background and the sharp angled appearance to the artwork, which Sega stopped using in the US by April of 1990. To me, I think that was a mistake, as this version of the cover formatting was the best that they ever got, dedicating the most real estate possible to the artwork, while still using the angled section below to showcase the game's title, And apparently Europe agreed with me, as they continued to use this angle type format for a while longer for PAL releases. The art itself is great, iconic even, with the speed lines going across the picture, and similar versions were used across all 3 regions. The only major difference I'll call out is the rear artwork that only appears in the Japanese release, continuing the tradition of Japanese versions having art on both the front and the back. Flipping over to the rear cover of our release, and there's that early Genesis release formatting of having one large screenshot at the top and then 2 smaller ones down at the bottom. The screenshots are of decent quality, but I've got to question Sega including the shot of the course selection screen. Sure, I get that they wanted to show that it was like the arcade version and had all 4 of the different courses to choose from, but it certainly doesn't do much to sell the game from a graphics perspective. The flavor text, on the other hand, is fantastic, and I love how descriptive they are with the feeling of excitement that the game is trying to convey. I especially like the line towards the end, "So grab your helmet, don your leathers, and get up your courage. It's time to burn some rubber and become king of the asphalt." Oh yeah, now I'm excited. That is how you sell a game. Opening up the box, and thankfully the manual and cartridge are in pretty good shape, with the manual looking like it's probably only been read a few times over its lifespan. At first, when you start to look at the manual, you might be surprised with how much content is included, as Super Hang-On is just an arcade racing game, right? Well, not exactly. As we'll talk about more in a minute, while Super Hang-On has the arcade mode that you're probably expecting, it also has an original mode, specific to the Genesis version of the game, and the manual fully fleshes out all the aspects of both modes, with tons of screenshots from the game and custom art that reflects the colorful cast of characters that you'll interact with over the course of original mode. Honestly, the only bad thing I can say about the manual is it has a puny high score section, rather than the full pages that you're probably used to. But that's the most nitty of nitpicks imaginable, as all games should hope to have a manual that looks this good. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and get our racing on. I mentioned earlier that the original Hang-On first appeared in the arcades on the original iteration of what would become known as Sega's Superscaler series of arcade boards. The reason why I say would become known as is because at the time of Hang-On's debut in 1985, the arcade hardware was only used for 2 games, Hang-On and Space Harrier, so the various arcade boards were named for those specific games, rather than given a generic series name. However, due to the success of both Hang-On and Space Harrier, Sega saw that it made sense to focus on 2 lines of arcade hardware rather than just one, and as a result, for the rest of the 80s and the early 90s, Sega would release games on both the Superscaler platform and the System platform, with the Superscaler platform games often being leveraged in both regular stand-up arcade cabinets and also deluxe sit-down cabinets that reflected piloting or driving something in the game, while the System platform was usually reserved for more typical 2D arcade games that utilized joysticks. Before Sega fully retired the Space Harrier Hang-On version of the Superscaler board, they decided to release a few more games for it in an attempt to maximize their investment before moving on to more powerful versions. Interestingly enough, both games were also motorcycle-based, with Enduro Racer first appearing in 1986, and then Sega fully went back to the well, releasing Super Hang-On as a true sequel to Hang-On in 1987. At first glance, you may not notice much of a difference between Hang-On and Super Hang-On when you're looking at the arcade versions. The cabinets themselves have some differences, especially if you're comparing the upright or deluxe ride-on versions of the games, but graphically they look pretty similar, which is somewhat to be expected with both of them utilizing the same back-end hardware. The main differences come from the actual structures of the games. Hang-On operated similarly to how Outrun works, with the goal simply being to make it through 5 concurrent stages before time runs out, and the rider earns additional time back to the clock for completing each stage. It's fine for a quarter-munching arcade game, but ultimately it's pretty simple, especially with it not having the branching courses that Outrun utilizes. This is where Super Hang-On comes in, as it takes the existing solid gameplay of Hang-On and expands upon it. Now, rather than having a single 5-stage race, you get the option of racing all over the world, with 4 different courses, and each having a specific difficulty level that goes along with the complexities of the courses, the opposing riders, and the length of the courses with how many stages they contain. You get the option of the beginner course in Africa, which has 6 stages, the junior course in Asia that has 10 stages, the senior course in the Americas that has 14 stages, and finally the expert course in Europe that has 18 stages. Also, those more difficult courses might seem long, especially if you're used to how long the stage length is in Hang-On or Outrun, but in reality the stages that make up the courses in Super Hang-On are about half the length of those other games, so they're not that long. As you might expect, an upgraded version of Hang-On was a hit in the arcades, and it's a game that I honestly think stands up to this day, especially if you get the chance to play the ride-on version where you sit on a mock version of a superbike and move side to side when turning. However, Sega had just released the original Hang-On for the Master System, so rather than port Super Hang-On to the Master System and have 2 similar games in what was at the time a relatively small console library, Sega instead opted to create an alternate version of Enduro Racer for the Master System to add some variety. Ultimately, with the similarities between the 2 games, I think this was the right decision by Sega, and it led to Super Hang-On being able to make its console debut for the Genesis platform instead in late 1989, which also turned out to be the only way to play Super Hang-On at home unless you happen to own a Sharp X68000 home computer, which of course no one outside of Japan did at the time. As mentioned, the Genesis port didn't make it out in time for the Genesis console launch in 1989, but it did appear shortly thereafter, and was one of the first 16 games available for the console in the United States. And in fact, Super Hang-On was one of the first games that I distinctly remember playing for the console. My uncle, who was an early adopter of the console, let me borrow his Genesis for a bit, and Super Hang-On was one of the games that he had for it at the time. I specifically remember having the Genesis hooked up to the same small, crappy CRT television that only had RF input and that I used for playing my Atari 2600. And let me tell you, even on a terrible TV like that, that jump from the 2600 to the Sega Genesis made it really seem like I was playing an arcade machine. I don't remember what other games I played on that setup, maybe Ghouls and Ghosts or Golden Axe, as he loved both of those games, but trying to slide my way around the European circuit is burned in my memory. Due to that, I've been curious for a while now as to how the game would hold up when I pulled it out for review over 30 years later. The answer? Actually, pretty great, to be honest. It does have a few quirks that I'll get to, but for a very early release on the console that's trying to replicate the action from a game originally running on much more powerful arcade hardware, the port is a massive success. And the best part is, Sega wasn't satisfied with just bringing the arcade version home to the Genesis. They went above and beyond and delivered a fun and challenging original mode as well. For the arcade mode, you get, surprise surprise, the arcade version of Super Hang-On. All of the courses from the arcade version are present, and the game plays exactly in the same manner, with you choosing from one of the 4 locations, depending on how easy or difficult you want your experience to be. And then it's you against the clock as you try to make it to the end of each stage on time. Also, it's slightly hidden, but there's a menu you can open before you start a game where you can choose the difficulty of both the racing and the time allotted on the clock if you want to really test your mettle, or perhaps ease things up a bit. If you're familiar with Outrun, these options will be very similar to what you may have seen in that game. Arcade mode is great, but what I think really makes Super Hang-On interesting is the original mode. Original mode has you as a motorcycle racer just starting out in their career and attempting to work your way up to being a champion. How does one do that? Well, you start out with a motorcycle made up of the cheapest components you can find, and boy does the bike feel like it. In those first few races, you're probably going to be struggling to make it around the track with a motorcycle that steers like mashed potatoes and accelerates like it's towing a small boat. If you're coming from playing the arcade mode, you're probably more than likely going to have to take a few races to try to get used to this bike that would have no chance of competing in even the easiest setting in arcade mode. Once you get acclimated to this vehicle that may or may not belong on the track with other racers, you can start your journey to the championship one rival at a time. As you win races, you'll earn money from your sponsor so that you can buy one of 6 types of upgraded parts for your bike, or perhaps hire a better mechanic to try to keep your bike running. However, it's not all fun and games because your bike parts will wear out and potentially break if you're too hard on your machine and don't keep things properly maintained. At first, this can be a bit frustrating because, as mentioned, your motorcycle starting out sucks, and until you memorize the tracks for each of the 7 levels, there's a good chance that you're going to be replacing all sorts of parts that the winnings from your original sponsor barely covers. For instance, the initial frame that you have access to, and that breaks after a few on-track crashes and run-ins with other drivers, costs $1,200. Your winnings if you win a race on level 1? $1,200. You see the problem here? Once you make your way out of the first level, the game starts to open up a bit, and with more money from your sponsor comes more options for what upgrades to buy. Do you blow all your cash on expensive frames and motors? Or instead try to be economical with smaller purchases, like higher quality tires and oil? The choice is yours, but you still have to make sure you take care of your bike, or else you'll risk not being able to afford decent replacement parts, and risk being relegated back to a lower competition level. I enjoyed this portion of the game immensely, and it starts to become a bit addictive. For instance, I quit recording footage from one of my sessions because I was about to stop playing for the night, and then I still ended up playing for about another hour because I kept thinking, just one more race, due to want to keep improving my bike and make it to the next level. One last interesting bit about original mode is that it features a password save system for continuing your game later, which is nice because the further you make it in the game, the longer the races get. But the password feature can be used for more than just continuing original mode progress. You can also use the password feature to import the hard work that you put on your original mode bike and use it in arcade mode. Now, you probably don't want to do that unless you've got a pretty tricked out bike, as the default bike in the arcade mode is pretty decent, but it's still a cool option and very unexpected. From a graphics perspective, Super Hang-On is a respectable effort. Does it look as good as the arcade version? No, of course not, as the Genesis version is a bit less colorful and doesn't support sprite scaling, so other tricks will have to be used to animate the on-screen action. As a result, things don't move around quite so smoothly, and you'll only ever see 3 other racers on the screen at one time. But even with that, the game still moves pretty well, and you'll still get a good sense of speed when you're able to hit a straight and mash the turbo. Also, the backgrounds, while relatively simple, are multi-layered, just as they are in the arcade version, and that's something I was not expecting on a first-generation Genesis title. Again, it's not perfect, but for 1989, it was as good as you were going to see on a console, and made the NES look like a children's toy. The sound in Super Hang-On is an unexpected surprise. The arcade version featured 4 different musical tracks that could be played during gameplay, similar to being able to use the radio in Outrun. All 4 tracks have been brought over to Super Hang-On, and they all sound fantastic. I honestly wasn't expecting much, as I figured that between the graphics and the additional game mode, there wouldn't be much room left in the game's 4 megabits of storage for sound, but they found a way to make it work. Sure, there's not a ton of sound effects included, so that's probably how it worked out, but overall, the game sounds great, especially for such an early release. Previously on the channel, I've reviewed a few other Super Scalar ports, and they've ranged from terrible in Super Thunderblade and pretty decent in Space Harrier 2. However, neither of those games were exact ports, with both being closer to re-imagings of the original games. Super Hang-On instead stuck to its roots, and in doing so is easily the best release of the 3 if you're looking to replicate the arcade experience at home. And if that wasn't enough, the addition of the original mode gives you a reason to play the game long after the courses from the arcade mode have gotten boring. Due to all that, and its relatively early release on the console, I'm giving Super Hang-On 3 stars. It may have eventually been superseded by the Road Rash series as the best motorcycle game on the console, but from late 1989 to late 1991, if you wanted some hot two-wheel action, Super Hang-On was the king of the mountain.
And that was Super Hang-On for the Genesis. I've got to admit, when I first started playing it, I definitely had thoughts about how it wasn't as good as I'd remembered it. And to be fair, that's not necessarily an odd thing to think about anything. Myself as an 11-year-old versus a 43-year-old, is going to have a vastly different outlook on things just due to that large difference in life experience and changing tastes. But after spending a few hours with it and getting readjusted to the controls, that same joy came back, and I really had a good time playing the game, to the point where there's a good chance I'll be pulling this one back off the shelf to play when I have some spare time. Spare time. Anyway, next week on Zilog and Moto, it's going to be a completely new experience. In episode 89, I played Coffee Crisis from Mega Cat Studios, a game that was originally released in 2017. Coffee Crisis was a game that was great in theory, but unfortunately needed some fine-tuning, so if you're interested, you probably want to take a look at the Steam version instead. However, Mega Cat Studios has released a few other games in recent years, and now I think it's time to try out another one. I don't know a whole lot about this game, but apparently it's an old-school hack and slash, and the screenshots that I've seen look very interesting, so hopefully this one will turn out to be better than Coffee Crisis. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 188. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos, but most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!